Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on pricing for creation and touring of outdoor shows. My name is Irene Segura, and I lead on international relations and talent development for Extracts. I'm a white Spanish woman in my 30s with dark curly hair, and today I'm wearing a red top with blue and orange flowers. Extracts is a UK-based development agency for outdoor arts, as well as one of the founding members and the current managers of Without Walls. Without Walls is the UK's largest consortium of outdoor arts festivals, dedicated to commissioning and touring new outdoor work. Without Walls also provides training and creates learning resources for artists and festivals on a variety of topics, including accessibility, COVID safety, environmental sustainability, international promotion, and many more. It is within this context that we are running today's webinar, which will provide practical advice on how to price outdoor shows to ensure they are viable, sustainable financially, and fit for touring. This session will be chaired by Phil Hargreaves. Phil Hargreaves is a creative producer who has worked with both artists and festivals across the UK, producing and curating a range of work at varying scales. Phil still works closely with artists as a freelancer, but is also the cultural program manager at Bradford Council. The session will be followed by a discussion with the opportunity to invite questions from the audience. We will get through as many questions as we can, and those that remain unanswered will be addressed in a follow-up document, which will be posted on the website. Before we proceed with the webinar, I just want to run through a few practicalities. We received more than 110 registrations for today's webinar, and it's great to see that so many of you are watching right now. If you would like to ask the panelists questions, please use the Zoom Q&A function. For access purposes, we are providing live captioning and VSL interpretation. To activate your captions, simply click on the button that says Captions. We are recording the session and will make it available on the Without Walls website after the event, alongside those additional resources. Feel free to comment, post, and tweet about this session, and make sure to follow Without Walls on social media. Finally, a few questions will come up as you exit the webinar, and we'd kindly ask you to take a few seconds to give us some feedback. I will now hand over to our chair, Phil, to kickstart the conversation. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, from a sunny Yorkshire. I am Phil Hargreaves. I'm a creative producer that has worked with a number of artists and festivals, supporting the development of wonderful outdoor activities for too many years to admit now. I am a white male. I'm 6'2", in my 30s, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm currently in my office in a new house, so I've blurred my background because there is a lot of unpacking yet to do. I have a turquoise polo neck jumper on and black glasses. It's a pleasure to be invited to chair this event with such an incredible range of speakers who have an extensive amount of experience across a range of outdoor activities. I'm joined today by Kevin, who is the co-founder of Split Second, a duo of international producers, Charmaine Childs, an independent artist and founder of Strong Lady Productions, and Andrew Kim, the co-artistic director of Thingumajig Theatre, who will all have the chance to share some of their knowledge and wisdom with you in a short while. It's pretty apt that I'm here today chairing this discussion, as I've spent the last few weeks pricing a range of work I have out on the road next summer. The conversations are a little different than before. COVID has left an unusual amount of space between performances and bookings. Some of the shows have had some time out and have not been on the road. Some we need to double cast for the safety of our performers, for the safety of people in the public, for the festivals and events that we want to take our work to. Some need extra rehearsals, additional insurances, and some need engineering checks so that we can ensure that our sets and production elements of our work are all safe for our performers. This is a lot to think about. It's a lot to take in, and it's a lot to develop alone as people, as independent artists, as organisations, and as individuals. That's why a session like this is a wonderful chance to hear from others who are going through exactly the same things we're going through at exactly the same time, talk openly about what they are doing. We're not alone in this journey, and I'm delighted to be here today to help share some of my experience, in the hope that it's helpful and useful in the not too distant future. So let's dive in. And first up, we've got Kevin. Over to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Phil. Hello, my name's Kevin. I'm the co-director and producer for Split Second. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a white male in my 30s, and today I'm wearing a green shirt, I've got black rimmed glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a brick wall behind me. I'm just going to screen share my presentation, so just give me a thumbs up, maybe Phil, if that's working. Yep, brilliant, I can see you. Great, so just to start with a kind of introduction to what Split Second is, we are a production company and we're working with artists and companies blurring the lines between circus, dance and theatre. We work with artists in a bespoke way at every stage of the process, from producing new work to touring existing work. And we work with a small focused portfolio. These are some of the artists we're currently working with. Many of whom are working in outdoor contexts. So you can see Simple Cypher there and Christopher Green, who were both part of the With It Walls consortium portfolio as well. In addition to this, we also facilitate a strand of work called Focal Point, which are a series of projects to help develop independent producers and artists and to strengthen the sector. And that takes shape through a series of mentoring, one-to-one sessions, workshops, panel talks like this, and commissioned research and consultancy, which I'll touch on a bit later on as a reference. So what I'll be covering today are just some key areas of focus or key considerations when you're approaching pricing your work. I will dip into 2 example budgets of work of different scale, just to show how budgets can vary depending on scale and structure. And then finally, just a few tips on shaping your show fees in order to sustain your practice. And just a few important points for context. Every bit of outdoor work is case by case. It depends on the scale, the content, the art forms, and the business model, like the structure of the company, organization, or individual. And I think that's really important because there's no one size fits all for approaching pricing work. Equally important, I'm considering the pricing of finished work. So in what I break down, there's no production costs or rehearsal costs reflected in the fees. It's a finished bit of work that's ready for touring. And then lastly, as I mentioned, there's no set formula for calculating costs. But what is important is having a system and understanding how you've arrived to that figure. So in terms of considerations for pricing work, the first area I'd encourage people to think around is staffing. So who's involved and for how long in order to make the show happen. This is probably going to cover artists, directors, creatives, how many people need to be present to deliver the show. Equally, are you working with production management, stage management, any production staff, for example, riggers? Do you tour with a producer or a core company team member for networking opportunities? And just a consideration that most of the touring party will have a travel day at least before performances. And if your show or equipment or your setup is large, then there might be a production team working a full day in advance. So getting a sense of who's involved and for how long obviously lets you calculate the costs attached to staffing to deliver the work. The next area of consideration is around equipment. So what's actually involved in the show and how does it get there? So with this, we're thinking about the scale of the work. So your set, your props, your equipment, costumes, etc. How much stuff is there? Do you own all of these items? Or are they hired each time you're doing the show? Are you using any consumables or things that will be need to be replaced each show? Or are there kind of costs attached to bits of equipment? Again, I'm thinking circus, there might be rigging checks, there might be wear and tear of equipment that needs replaced over time. And I think these are costs that are really important to put into your show fees as well in terms of sustainability. Equally important, how are the items getting to the festival? Are you hiring a van to move this stuff if you're a larger show? Are there parking costs? Is there petrol charges to and from storage, etc.? So it's kind of thinking, in addition to just delivering the show, what's the kind of bookend work that happens inside of it in order to get the stuff there? And just a little note that festivals will cover the touring party travel, whether they're traveling in public transport or car, van and mileage, plus accommodation. But if there's additional costs like van hire attached to the movement of equipment, then I would be building them into fees rather than trying to charge that to a festival. So we've talked about staffing, we've talked about equipment. An equally important area are your overheads. So what are the kind of ongoing overheads connected to A, the work, and B, your company, your organization? And this really depends on your business model, or if you've got funding subsidy, obviously that might impact what overheads you put into show fees. But this might include things like your annual insurance, storage, if you're working with storage, any kind of bank charges, a contribution toward your rent, your utilities to run your company. It might include some core company staff time for project management and producing and tour management, etc. Another overhead could be a re-rehearsal period before touring. If you need to do that, how is that being financed? Is it Arts Council subsidised, or is it kind of company subsidised in terms of company pay that work forward and then make that back through touring? And when you've got a sense of what your overheads are, these could appear in a budget either as a fixed fee, generally if it's kind of staff related. So it could be a number of days of staff time as an overhead to deliver this, or if you're a slightly larger organization with insurance, storage, it might come sit in as an overall project management fee. And anything between 10 and 30% is fairly standard. It's worth noting that, adding these key areas together gives you your kind of baseline minimum cost. It doesn't mean the work has to go out for that cost. You can take it out for more, but anything additional to those three areas is profit, and obviously goes into your company as reserves. And we'll look at that in a bit more detail as we go. So next, I'm going to tap into a few show sample budgets. The first one I'm going to talk through is a small scale dance duet. It's a touring party of 3, so 2 dancers and 1 choreographer on the road. There's no set or equipment, costumes go in hand luggage, and the crew travel on public transport, so it's very low tech. And this is a self-producing company. There's low overheads due to the scale and the fact that they're self-producing and kind of a small scale dance duet. Before I go through line by line, it's just worth noting I break budgets down into 1-day fees and 2-day fees, and you can see off the back that some of the fees don't just quite double. So your artist fees from 1 day to 2 days aren't quite double, which is fairly standard. So what we've got here are obviously 2 dancer fees in there, so 200 for 1 day of shows or 350 for 2 days. The choreographer fees in there, which matches the dancers' fees. You can see the travel days there. That's because the artists and choreographer have traveled the day before in order to be on site for the festival starting early morning. That's charged then about 75 for the day of travel. I think anything between 50 and 80 seems fairly normal for travel days. And some people split that into whether it's a full day of travel or a half day of travel. So kind of split the day in depending on when you leave, depends on what you're charging for travel. You can see there's a company management fee of 20%. So that's 20% of all the fees that are above that. And that's towards general project management time. We said that this is a self-producing company, so there's no fixed staff costs, but it acknowledges the time that they have to put in to get that work out. And it also starts to grow their reserves. You see there's a small contingency in there as well of 5%, which takes us to just under 1,200 for one day of shows and just over 1,700 for 2 days of shows. As I said earlier, this is kind of the baseline for what that work could go out for. It doesn't mean that's what you'd approach a festival. You might want to add a kind of profit on top of that, but ultimately, you know, that's your baseline for what you shouldn't be going below. So the next show example is slightly larger scale. So we're saying this is a piece of mid-scale aerial dance work. So there might be an aerial rig or some kind of scaff structure set up, basically a lot of equipment. This is a larger touring party of 5, so 4 artists and a production manager. And just because of the scale of this, it requires a van to move the equipment and storage between shows. So we're thinking higher overheads right away. This company, we're saying, are working with a freelance producer who looks after their tour booking and tour management. So there'll be some fixed producing costs in this budget. A production manager is responsible for moving and building the set and working with the festival team to run the show. So again, we're thinking there's an additional day of production management fees that will be reflected in this budget because they'll be working at the day in advance of the festival. And we're saying this is a more established company. The work's been touring before, so no choreographer, no director is present. So same structure here. We've got 1 day fees and 2 day fees. The top 4 lines you'll see are the performers as mirrored in the previous budget. We've got travel days for 4 artists. And it's just worth noting, this doesn't change from 1 day of shows to 2 days of shows because, you know, say they're performing Friday, Saturday, they'll have traveled on that Friday. Sorry, if they perform Saturday, Sunday, they'll have traveled on the Friday. So it's still 1 day of travel. And generally, we try and return all artists and team on the day of the final shows. You can see there's a fixed producer fee of 2 days at 200. Again, that's just a flat rate, whether they're going for 1 day or 2 days. It's generally the same amount of work from contracting to tour logistics that needs to go into that. You will see production management sits at 2 days of work for a 1 day performance or 3 days of work for 2 days. And that's because that Friday, for example, they'll be collecting equipment, driving it to the site, probably doing a site check, site visit. So they're working that day rather than just traveling. So it's a higher fee, and you notice they're not included under travel days because they're getting paid for that work. There's van hire attached to this and petrol. So again, this mirrors production management. There's 2 days of van hire for a 1 day gig or 3 days for 2. I've put some petrol into that as well. Depending on how you're traveling, you might be able to charge mileage to a festival, but there might be some kind of base travel that needs to happen, collection, drop-offs and stuff that you might just want to have some petrol money in that. This is a larger scale company, so there's a 20% management fee which contributes towards their annual insurance, storage, equipment maintenance, and bookkeeping, etc. And you see they come out as healthy numbers because again, they're a management fee on everything that sits above that. So there's some money to play with there in terms of running costs. It's the same 5% contingency, which takes us to 2,300 for 1 day of performances, or just over 3,900 for 2. So hopefully that's a good example in terms of thinking of those 3 key areas of staffing, equipment, and overheads, and seeing how that applies to shows of different scales. I just want to wrap up with a final tips on shaping these fees. I think it's really important to cost it out. Don't just pluck numbers from the air. Have a system to understand what your show costs. As I said before, cost a 1 day and a 2 day. You might want to have a 3 and a 4 day as well. And I think it's important to stipulate the number of shows that are included in that. So as a standard, we're doing 1 day of shows, 1 day, 2 shows, 2 day, 4 shows. That's because we're working a lot with circus and dance artists. I know for walk around and for more parade-based work, that might be different. I think it's important to know what your minimum budget is and not to go below this. So in those previous budgets, in a sense, that's the minimum that the work can go out for. And unless strategic and a calculated decision, it's probably wise to not go out for below your minimums. This is an interesting one. I think depending on your relationship with the company and performers, might be worth considering an ideal fee and a minimum fee. You'll see there's some fixed costs in those budgets that we just can't reduce. The things around equipment movement and overheads, they're generally fixed costs. The one area where we can shave costs is on fees for staff. So again, depending on what your setup is, if you're an emerging company, you might have ideally we go out for 200 a day, but if needs be, we can shave that back to 150, 175 or something. So there might be some small areas where you could tweak a kind of minimum budget, but that really depends on your relationship. And I think always include a percentage towards company management. How do we do that? We try and get a sense of what our yearly overheads are. So what does it cost to run and sustain your company for a year? And you can average that across company activities. That might just be outdoor touring if that's all you do. It might be split across education projects, indoor touring and outdoor touring. Again, it's back to point one, it's important to cost it out and not just make it up. Another tip, speak to similar companies or programmers just to try and get a kind of benchmark fee for what the scale of your work should cost. But do keep in mind that more established companies can charge higher fees based on reputation. A really important point is you want to cost different budgets for international touring, which now includes EU touring, thanks to Brexit. It's safe to expect more administrative resource costs and costs attached to moving people, so staff, and goods, so equipment and set and costume, etc. And then just a little plug, we were commissioned by Extracts to produce a guide to outdoor touring post-Brexit, which is really useful in terms of breaking down what these costs might look like. And there's hypothetical budgets attached to that as well. And actually Andrew from Thingumajig on the panel was one of the case study companies. So that's worth checking out if you're interested in European touring. If your show fees come out too high, you have to be realistic. Shows cost what they cost. But you might need to consider a different touring model. So either fundraising to offset some of the costs or subsidizing your own company reserves to offset those costs. Or that might be commercially doing more commercial gigs to offset your outdoor touring. Whatever, there's various methods for that. And last little tips. I've spoke so much about money and logistics, but we don't quote our fees in dossiers or tour packs. We want to get the programmers excited by the work, and then we move on and talk about the money. So as much as the system and the finances are super important, like we're artists and creatives, we want people to be excited by the work and the experience. So that for me comes first. Oh, and that's just a little plug again to the Extracts guide to Brexit touring. which is on the Extracts website, and I'm sure will be circulated afterwards. Last little thing, just connect with us, follow us. I'm happy to answer more questions in specific detail. I know we've got limited time today, but thank you very much. And I hope I've not went too long over, Phil.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Kevin. I have seen a question has come in, so we'll pick it up really quickly now. When the example budgets that you showed, what were the lengths of the shows that you were expecting?
That is a really good question. I don't think it matters, to be honest, because the artist fees are they've been bought out for the time to do those shows. But yeah, I mean, in terms of average length, dance to it, anything between 20 and 30 minutes, anything longer feels long. For a show of 4 or 5 people, you know, if you want to position it as an end of festival or kind of headliner thing, between 30 and 40 minutes. Anything more is hard to hold an audience, I think, for outdoor.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. Lots to digest and think about, lots shared, which is great. Lots of information in there. For sure, that's really helpful. And I didn't get to the point you're at until quite a considerable few years down the line in my career of touring outdoor work. So it's amazing to share that with people. And when we're thinking about overheads, you know, I, for some apparent reason, tend to produce shows that have sets and large sets for some apparent reason. It's a total accident. I don't know why it's happened to me. I always take into consideration if that set is very bespoke for that particular piece of work. So it isn't a company cost for us actually to store that set. It should be a cost that's spread over all of the performances that we have in that year to cover the cost of that. So in our overheads, we're very much thinking about the set storage costs, £2,000 a year, and we've got 10 shows, so we have to claim that back over the storage or the additional insurance element for us around that set and so forth. So thanks for sharing all that wonderfulness with us. It's very much appreciated. So next up, we have the incredibly talented Charmaine Childs.
Hello.
Over to you.
Thanks, Phil. Hello, I'm Charmaine. I am an independent, self-producing, solo, mostly artist. I have done other shows, but let me just get my thing sharing, do that awkward bit. 1 second. And then we go like that. And Phil, can I ask for a check-in that worked as well? Thank you. Brilliant. Excellent. So I'm Charmaine, Strong Lady Productions. I have, if you know me at all, you probably know my main work, which has been my solo Strong Lady show, which, as you can see, involves touching lots of strangers. So it is on the shelf currently for the foreseeable future until COVID's not a thing. In the past, I've also produced and toured a duo show, Leap, with Ruben ... And my first kind of international touring work was Ski Boom with a company called Tutti Frutti that I started with a friend of mine a million years ago. I've also toured a bit with Mario, Queen of the Circus, in a duo acrobatic comedy show. And I had the pleasure of touring with Mimbra for a year and helping with making their show Falling Up. And currently I'm touring in this summer, I toured a new outdoor work called Strong Enough that was a commission of the Without Walls Festival. And I've been touring outdoors for about 20 years. And until Strong Enough, all my work was self-funded. And this has been my very first thing that has been funded and commissioned. And it was a pleasure. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But that show has been touring this year, been a really nice thing, but has been a very different style for me. And I'll go into that a bit more later, but the interesting thing is in making funded work, how much more risk I was able to take in making work that I didn't know for sure would sell. It did, which is great. But that is something to take into consideration. When you're making funded work, you've got a huge amount more safety behind you. So touring as a self-producing solo artist is what they asked me to talk about today. And I will not be doing a fancy budget like Kevin did, because I was asked not to. They didn't want to double up everything. But even if they'd asked me to, I couldn't have done it quite as well as he did. So I'll leave you with those ones. The main point I want to make about touring work and making work that is sustainable is that as you're making it, especially if you're making work that doesn't have funding, making work that aims as much as possible to be for the broadest range of people and for the broadest range of environments and situations means that you are able to work more and you're able to fit what more people are looking for, which means that your work is going to connect with more people, that your work is going to have more impact, and that you are going to have more work, which is what is going to make things financially viable if you are working without funding. Because all my work, I've always tried to make it for everyone and for everywhere. It has meant that I've been able to work in 28 countries so far. I've done shows in 7 languages. I've worked in places from arts festivals through to busking festivals and a little bit of busking on the hard street. I've done corporate gigs with my outdoor shows. I've worked on high streets in like beginning festivals where I'm the first bit of outdoor arts that's been put on that high street, and being that introduction to that world for people. I've taken my outdoor show to schools, and I've taken elements of it and been able to pop it in variety shows to also kind of supplement how I can work over time. Excellent. When you are self-producing solo person, it is a lot to hold on to it all. And it's not so much a pricing thing, but because the admin time can mountain up and make it completely unviable, I really encourage you to set up systems, because systems are what's going to make it sustainable to be able to let the show fees cover your admin time in some kind of way. So I try to minimize admin time as much as I can. One of those ways is to make a really comprehensive info pack that you can send out when someone says, I'm interested in your work. You can send them something that answers, hopefully, almost every question that they have. I agree with Kevin in that I wouldn't necessarily put my pricing into that. I've also started touring in indoor work, and a lot of venues requested that I put my fee into my info pack, which I did for the indoor, but I much prefer to be able to say, like Kevin did, send out the info pack, let them know why the show is going to work, and then have the discussion around money in emails after that. There's also, Dropbox or other sorts of things like that, where if you just set up, if you know the things that everyone's going to ask for in emails, your collection of promo photos and videos, the insurance, the risk assessment, the method statement, all those things, if you get them all together at the beginning of the booking process and put them all in Dropbox folders that you can just send a link to, it means you're going to save the number. It took me a really long time to learn that trick of just not spending so much time in emails. And the final thing that has saved me the most admin time is setting up at the beginning of the booking process a spreadsheet with a page for each gig that you're going to be doing. And as soon as it kind of gets to pencil point, I put this together, and in it, I'll put all the information that is coming in the emails, so that I never have to sit and sift through emails to try and find a bit of information or ask again a bit of information. So I'll have in that, all of the details of where and when the gig is, obviously the accommodation, what the parking details are, what, like a little notes section for if they tell me something specific about that gig, like it's the mayor's birthday and he's going to come in at the beginning of your show, can you get him a round of applause, whatever, like those kinds of little weird notes that you would just forget. Also, I have a checklist in there of all the things that I would need to send to people. And I can check it off as I've sent it, including my invoice, and then a little spot to put whether that invoice got paid or not. All those things, just so that at a glance, you can look at it and see what information you still need and what information you have. Those things aren't necessarily pricing, but they do make it all much more sustainable as an independent person trying to do everything yourself. The logistics side of things is, I like to think of the constraints of making a show viable for touring as part of the creative process rather than an impediment to it. So if you can make work that works in more places, you get to work more. But also, if you think through every step of the logistics and think about future you who's going to be at the gig and what you can do to make that workload sustainable, and that way you're going to have a show that doesn't kill you to tour it. Yeah, when you know that you're going to need to be focusing on the performance when you're there. And I don't I noticed when I toured this summer in the Without Walls festivals, so many artists were traveling with a producer or a choreographer or a stage manager. And when you tour solo without any support people, it makes the show way more financially easy to make it work, but it also adds to your workload. So thinking through everything, like ease of travel and setup. Until this current show, Strong Enough, all my shows were suitcase shows. They could fit in a suitcase that I could take on a plane or a train or throw in the back of my car. This show needs to travel in a car, but still I thought through every step of, okay, I need a trolley to move it all on so that I can do everything in one trip. If it's raining, how do I transport it? Okay, I made a little waterproof cover. Like all of those things, just think it through in advance and make it as simple as possible. There were some creative ideas that I had where I would have made it all much more complicated for myself. And I weighed it up and I was like, if those ideas would have made it a different show, then I probably would have just dealt with the difficultness. But I found, I just kept weighing it up and going, does that extra difficulty warrant the wear and tear on me as a person trying to do everything? And I would weigh those things up step by step. Think about things like it's outdoor performance. So what surfaces can you perform on? What weather can you perform in? And test it in advance. So try and test things as early as possible. If you think that you're going to, in Strong Enough, I was like, I'm going to balance on these bricks. And I didn't test it on grass until really far into the rehearsal creation time, and then realized that I couldn't do it on bumpy grass, and then had to find a solution. But if I had tested a bit earlier, I could have embedded that solution maybe a little bit better. So if you just keep thinking about it, and things like if you're going to tour with dance floor, then as soon as there's any moisture in the air, that dance floor turns into an ice rink. So maybe without dance floor, you can't do the work you want to do. So then you need to tour with dance floor and you need to not be able to perform in the rain. If you can weigh those things up as you go and try and make it that, you can perform in as much a range of weather as possible and as many different surfaces as possible, you give yourself the best chance of being able to work in as many situations as possible. Also keeping an idea as you're creating about the range of work opportunities that are out there and seeing how wide you can keep the appeal of your show, so that potentially, one of the things that has made things really sustainable for me has been that my show is a crossover show that can go to a busking festival, can go to an arts festival in Europe or in the UK, or it can go onto a high street in the very first iteration of a festival and be the thing that introduces people to that world. That also brings in thinking about language. Can you make it so that the show can go to places where English isn't the main language? It doesn't mean you have to, but the more doors you can open for yourself, the better. And finally on that, I choose to tour alone to make the show viable, which means that I need to operate all my own technical equipment. So I've done things like I've got a little Bluetooth remote and I run the music off of the Go Button app on my phone, which is basically the mobile version of QLab. So it gives you loads of capability with the soundtrack, but it's just on the phone. So those kinds of things make it really possible to still have a show that has that artistic quality, but doesn't require a technician to be with you. I also, having a budget for creation for Strong Enough, which I've never had before, was able to invest in my own sound system to travel with, which I hadn't really done before. And that has made a big difference. I really recommend it where you can, because it's opened up a bunch of other opportunities for spaces I could perform in where they would not necessarily have had a sound system that was the quality that I needed, or maybe they chose, when people are weighing up you versus someone else, being able to be an independent package sometimes is the thing that might just boost you up over the edge. So in terms of pricing on my own, I separate it out a little bit for people. I say, this is the fee for the shows plus travel and accommodation. And then I ask for hotel accommodation for the night before the gig. Like Kevin, I tend to leave after the last show to get home that day. I quote mileage costs, but I am very flexible about those. Where possible, I ask people just to cover the exact mileage costs, but sometimes people can't fit it in their budgets. And so that's the place where I be flexible. When people offer a per diem, I gratefully accept it, but it's not something that I personally have added into my ask from people. And I tend to reduce for more than 2 days, rather than a 1 day fee and a 2 day fee. But I also, that's what I ask of people, and then they come back and we go from there. And I tend not to, again, it's kind of saving email time. I tend not to backwards and forwards too much over pricing. I say what I would like. If they can't fit that in their budget, I ask them to tell me what is the best they can do. And then I accept it or I don't. And I try not to ever accept something that I'm going to end up feeling resentful of. I just if they offer something that is reduced, but it's enough that I feel like I can take it, then I forget about the fact that there was any reduction and I go to that gig and play it like any other. Because most of my work before was self-funded, I didn't have paid rehearsals, and I would tend to make the beginning of a show and then I would take it off to uncurated busking festivals, things like Edinburgh Fringe. There's a similar one in Avignon in France. There's Adelaide Fringe Festival has a busking element. So I'd take it to these places where I could do a few weeks of a lot of shows and just experiment and test and try things out. When I was putting Strong Lady together, I went to Avignon and Edinburgh one after the other, and I was doing in Avignon like 4 or 5 shows a day just on different pitches to try and figure it out. And then I came to Edinburgh and got as many shows in as I could. And by the end of that summer, I felt like I'd found the show, but I didn't get to have those like in-depth rehearsal periods you get if the work is funded. And having funded work, also with self-funded work, I did work with collaborators here and there, but it was always at mates rates and, or swaps for collaborations with them. And it was never really in-depth. Funding has meant that I was able to have a full creative team, which enabled a whole bunch more risks because I had people to support me to make those risks work. But I also made sure to use that funding to get mentoring from those collaborators, especially my sound designer. He gave me a bunch of mentoring as well. And also the director of the show, Charlotte Mooney, she mentored me a lot as well, so that I've got skills I can take forward into future work where I potentially won't have funding to create it, or where I can then take on those roles in other people's work.
Sorry to chip in, Charmaine, just 1 minute to go.
Thanks, babe. That's good. I'm at the last little bit. So also in thinking about making your work be able to get as much work as possible to make it viable, if you think about embedding access, you open up as the doors as wide as possible to more audiences. But I don't think of it purely in terms of people who have specific needs. I think of it in terms of less confident audiences as well. The same things that make your performance a relaxed performance can also help to engage younger children more, or to get people who don't know that sort of work is for them, if they're going to understand what's going on. And so there's just a little list of some of the things that you can do for embedding access. And the other thing is having engagement projects that are really authentic to you, not just a pasted on workshop. Can more and more people who are booking work are looking to also be able to find deeper ways to engage with their communities. And so if you have something really interesting to offer alongside your shows, then that can mean that you get an extra whole bit of work that you can do in that community and with that booker, rather than just coming in and letting them see your show. And basically it's helping your work to reach more people, but it's also helping you to get more work. And that was everything. I did it. Amazing.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Lots and lots of information there to consider, to take in, especially around pricing when you're looking at creation, and if you need a dance floor, do you have to tour with it? Who provides that? Who pays for that? Also, then, if you're making a piece of work in an environment that has a sprung floor, for example, actually, should you be making it outdoors? And then do you need a dance floor to be outdoors? And the costings around those type of logistics in the creation period are all things that sometimes we kind of overlook a little bit. I actually have a really interesting booking sheet. So once I get a booking, I have a sheet that I send to the festivals like you do, and it asks for like intense amounts of information. It's literally like, do you have any site restrictions? So like, I know some festivals, you have to be there before 9 a.m. to get on site. So if you've got a set to unload, you have to have got there, unloaded, set up, and got the truck off before 9, which might result in extra travel costs, overnight costs, travel days, all that kind of stuff. So I have this sheet that kind of like unpicks loads of those nitty gritty things you were talking about. So
yeah, and I've also am in the process of making like a template version of my form for some other people, so I can share that with people if they want to see what my spreadsheet looks like. But also I forgot to say one thing. I'm going slightly over now, but I agree with Kevin in that if you as a solo are trying to figure out what to charge, when I was trying to figure out, I just asked people who were making similar work to what I was going to make, and had those conversations and figured out kind of where I sat in that. And then I started putting it out there and then responded to the reactions from bookers to shape that fee.
Great. Excellent. So we're going to dive straight into our next speaker, which is Andrew Kim. Thank you for that, Charmaine. Wonderfully insightful, and thanks for sharing all of that amazingness. Andrew, are you all set?
Yes, I'm all set. Thank you.
Over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Kim, and I'm one of the co-directors of Thingumajig Theatre. And I am an East Asian male in my early 50s with black short hair and glasses. And I'm currently in my office and wearing a gray shirt. I'm going to share my screen. 1 second, please. There we go. Share and play.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thingumajig Theatre creates touring giant puppet street acts and plays from our base in Hebden Bridge, West Yorkshire. My wife, Kathy, and I started the company in 2006. We were both experienced touring artists at that time, and I was a puppet and parade maker. Kathy was, or as is, an actor-musician, and we started originally by making two-hander plays, such as the ones here, usually for family audiences, not necessarily that tour to theaters and art centers. Over time, shortly thereafter, we started making giant puppets for parades and events, and these seem to be in demand. There's a lot of festivals in the UK, and they were interested in the kind of puppets we had. So we started moving up to the outdoor world, and first for specific events, and then eventually we started creating walkabout characters and performances in some of these, like the ones we have here. But then we've also, as a company, we make bespoke puppets for giant puppets for our clients, such as these three here. This one, the one on the left, is for an opera. The bird up above was just for the COP26 event that happened in Glasgow and around the world, actually. And we were making some birds to represent the RSPB and their actions for conservation. And then this one below is a lion, which is made for Chester Zoo for their lantern. In fact, incidentally, that lion and our orangutan puppets will be on Blue Peter today at 5 p.m. And yes, I did get a badge. We also make work with puppets in communities. So, for instance, this event here on the left is we spent 3 weeks in Newcastle working with local artists and volunteers making a big giant puppet performance. That was earlier this year. And the photo on the upper right is we spent 2 weeks in Prague teaching how to make lantern masks, and made this giant rooster for a carnival there in Rostoki. And then the one below there is a giant puppet workshop we did in Shrewsbury with their Morris dance team. So, how do we make a viable business? So I mentioned those three things, the giant, even though we're mostly talking about giant the outdoor arts, I wanted to talk about the other strands of the work because we do the commissions and we do the residencies, the workshops, and I think we have a diverse. Oh, sorry, I shouldn't have gone back to this slide yet. We have a diverse portfolio. I'm sorry, that's sort of business talk, but we have lots of things that we can offer, and so when one strand is less busy, we're able to focus on other bits. For instance, in this time of year, we're really busy doing our nighttime Ghost Caribou Act for various light switch-ons and festivals. But in January, February, March, there isn't that much festival work, and we're focusing mostly on doing residencies and teaching work. And so we were able to keep busy doing similar work that we love to do throughout the year. How do we make this a viable business? We are two full-time partners, and we are the business structure of our organization is a partnership, and we are earning just enough to be content, and that might mean different things for different people, but both of us have been full-time artists all our adult lives, and the only way you can survive doing that is to live on very little and still be content. And so early on in the process, we decided, how much do we need to cover all our expenses and have a little bit extra for fun? And then we sort of figured that out, and we said, Thingumajig Theater is going to pay us this, and we will work full time. And we've been doing that for 15 years, and it works for us. Every once in a while, we give ourselves a raise, and a few times we've had to sort of take a little bit of a pay cut for a very brief period of time if we weren't getting enough work. But that only has happened maybe a handful of times, including during COVID times. But anyway, we're back to normal. Kathy and I are both makers, performers, and we split the admin duties because those are for artists. Admin isn't necessarily a natural fit, but we figured out a system. I do the first half, which is getting the gigs and getting the specific details of the gigs, and then all the things that have to do with money, the invoicing and paying people, that all is done by Kathy. We own our own van, and all our acts fit in this van. This is really important because obviously, well, not obviously, but we are known for our big puppets, but we make sure that we take the time that the puppets fit in the van, because that is how we keep one of the main ways we keep our costs down. we are fortunate enough to have an affordable shared workshop space. We need a lot of space for our giant puppets, and we've been lucky enough to work with a parade company, Handmade Parade, which I used to be the director of, and we rent a portion of that space, and that has made our really it's an important part of keeping our overhead reasonable. And we are fairly good at regular savings and having a van fund for the time when we'll need to replace our van. So we make sure that whatever happens in the company, that we're constantly saving up so that we are never we're ready for any eventualities. How do we pay for touring? Well, as I said over and over again, you have to keep your costs down. You have to figure out how to keep your costs down. Can you do it with less performers or crew? Can you do it with less vehicles? And for us, it's really about being clever and being as big as you can for the smallest team and for the fewest vehicles. So we've really learned how to do everything ourselves. As Charmaine was saying, all the technical things, all the admin things, we do as much as possible. And so even though we might look big on the streets, we're actually a very small business with mostly 2 people, and then occasionally with freelancers coming in. And then this is add in business costs. So add in business costs and profit for the business. When I say profit, I don't mean like, earnings that we take home, but earnings that we put back into the development of future work. So this picture here, it's one of the proudest things, really. I mean, you might think the puppets look all right, but actually, this is the pack for Ghost Caribou, which looks like that. So it's got a big impact on the street at an event. This is at Wratten Festival. This is a show that was, by the way, developed with Without Walls blueprint development funds, which we're very grateful for. But you'll notice that the one puppet is a little bit wider than the other. And that's because the puppets need to nest into each other. I'm going to go back and fit into our short wheel-based transit van. And that's really super important, that when I was designing that puppet, I measured and remeasured and make sure that we could do it without hiring a Luton van or having an additional vehicle. Okay. Here's an example. I took one of our acts and this is not exactly true, but it's mostly true. But I'll give you an example of how we price things. And I'm afraid I'm not quite as legitimate of a company as a spreadsheet you might have seen earlier, but this is the way we figure something out. We have a base cost of each of the acts going out. Now, this is a walkabout act, and this is a 2-person act. And most of our acts are 2-people acts because it's me and Kathy starting the act, creating the act, and then eventually when we need, we bring in other performers into it. Sometimes we have more than one bookings at an event. Sometimes I'm teaching a residency, so I can't do that. But for the most part, they're 2-people acts. But we've costed it so that we can have other people doing the acts with somebody else's hire van and still make earnings for it that is reinvested into the company. So this is £770 is the basic cost of having Plucky come to your event, 3 sets of 40 minutes. And it's mostly true. And I say that because if it's a local event or if it's something that we can do exchange in, we might come down a little bit. But we as the other artists have said earlier, we don't necessarily print this or publish this anywhere, but it's a thing that we have in the back of our heads. Same thing with mileage. Mostly we calculate 35p a mile from our base. I know some companies do more and some companies do less, but we found that that's a reasonable amount to ask for. And then accommodation, if it's 2 hours, more than 2 hours from our base, and that will get added on to all of this. So for example, Plucky going to Preston, which is about 40 miles from Hebden Bridge, our base, this will be about £770 with our base cost, and then £28, which is the mileage times 2 because it's a return journey, and that comes to about £798. And then that fee, The fee on the bottom is important, and that's how we got to 770, by the way. So if we were to bring in 2 artists, for us, our daily rate for our freelance performance is £180 per day. And then, so if we needed 2 performers to do that, that would be £180 per day. Plus, if we needed to do a van hire, maybe account for 2 hires. I mean, that's 2 days of van hire, because sometimes, like on a gig on a Saturday, you can't just rent for 1 day, which is really annoying. But anyway, so that's accounting for the top end of what a van hire might be, £140, and diesel to actual diesel, not mileage, to Preston and back to put into the hire van. And that comes to about £540. If you subtract that from what we're asking from our client, that's 258 or so. And so our sort of golden figure is that we need at least £250 back into the company for that will cover our admin, and that will cover our reinvestment into the company. So it's not as a need of a solution as 20% or 15%, but this is what has worked for us. So so it might be a bigger act, but we might need to make sure that if we're not getting at least 250, then it's not a gig that we can afford to do. Now, bear in mind, most of the times it's me and Kathy performing in our own van, so that 180 would be much less because we're getting paid a monthly fee, salary. And of course, we wouldn't need the hire van because we use our own van. Of course, there's costs of having a van, but it's considerably less. And so if we were doing this ourselves, there would probably be several hundred more going back into the company. Some other touring costs that we consider is that once again, accommodation. We get single rooms unless we're a couple like Kathy and myself. If we're over 2 hours away, and travel days, we pay. This is what we pay. Although I think we might change it. I think we might need to go a little bit up, but we usually break it up into half days, which is £50 for half days. For instance, if it's a Saturday gig and you have to drive 4 hours to get there, the night before we'll start driving at 4 p.m. or 3 p.m. and then pay that artist £50. And then if it's more than 5 hours, we pay for a full day, which is £100. Meal allowance. This is something that's really depends on. We always try to provide at least one meal for the artist if the venue isn't providing a hot meal for them. And so that might be depending on where it is. Obviously, it's more for international things, but if it's a fairly local gig, it might just be something a little bit less. But we usually sort of work that in somehow as well. And it's really, we especially when we're out touring with other people, it's really important that there's a company meal and the company pays for a meal and a drink after they've done their job. How do we pay for creation of new work? So we're not regularly funded. We have sort of a bit of a hybrid. We apply for grants for most of our new projects, like This Is Jellish that we had, and that was a Arts Council funded project, and so was Kit and Caboodle and the Mechanical Hippo that we have. Ghost Caribou, as I mentioned, was something that we got some support with the Without Walls, but we do also have some self-funded projects like the Dodos, which you saw in the first photo, and the Sunbirds. These are puppets that we created ourselves, and then we created the street theater act around them, and then we earned it back over time. And it's a very different process of how you fund that, because I mean, if it's self-funded, obviously you're not paying yourself while you're doing it, but you earn it back, and that allows certain freedoms. And you could just, for instance, right now we are in the process of making 2 different acts. One of them is self-funded, and one of them is funded with another Without Walls blueprint funds. And there's different things, different teams of artists you can use. Obviously, if it's funded, but if it's not funded, it takes a lot longer, and you just have to be a little bit wiser of what you think will for sure get bookings. And then we have
just coming in to say 1 minute left.
Oh, sorry, I'm going too slow. Okay. And then we also have some other projects where we are adapted from other pieces that we've already created. I'm just going to go into the last couple slides fairly quickly. Sorry, costs of making things. The way we operate, and maybe we're a little bit unique, that we're probably not unique at all, but we like to do, over time, we've learned how to do everything that our company needs, almost everything. So we do all our own fundraising, we do our devising, we make our own puppets, Kathy composes the music, and like Charmaine, we've learned how to do our own technical things, and of course we do our own PR. And so because of that, it becomes very much self-sufficient. There are occasionally, we need specialists like a welder or a director that comes in, and we usually, depending on that person and how long of a project, it's usually 150 or 200 a day. And then we also sometimes need additional artists just to come in and help us finish things. And that's sometimes 120 or 150 a day. The final thing is just a few little ideas, tips on the future developing your own work. Give your idea time to breathe. I think most of our projects usually take a year and a half to work out, and then even more time for it to really find its feet in front of an audience. Give yourself devising time and space. We've really been blessed with having space like at the 101 Creation Center, where you can really focus on just your show. Book test audiences, because it's never what you think in your head when you actually have it in front of an audience. You'll need all the time you have, and it's hard to say how much time you need, because you'll need more, but you'll have to do it anyway. And you always need time to adjust after your first audience. There's never a show that just works. You have to be willing to change it and adjust it. It's always worth it to pay for professional photos and videos, because a good photo, a good video will sell the work. And then also be the company that you want to work for. Treat your colleagues, your freelancers, as well as you'd like. Really look out for their needs, pay them well, treat them well, give them credit in the work, all that kind of thing. And also, I think it's just being honest with how hard it is, and how many people it takes to create a work. And sorry, I ran over, but this is us doing Kit and Caboodle at the Skipton Puppet Festival. And if you'd like to connect with us on the social media, that we're at Thingumajig Theatre. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Andrew. Sharing lots of useful things and pieces of information and hints and tips and wonderfulness that hopefully is helpful for a lot of people. So we've had an incredible amount of information there, covering budgets and unexpected costs, some things that we've stumbled across as people, which we may not have known about and we've had to learn and find alternatives for. I am just going to ask all the panelists if they could turn on their cameras and join us back in the space now. One of the things I wanted to say was contingencies can be absolute saving graces in a project. So when you do a budget, if you allow contingency funds in case something appears that you didn't expect to appear or didn't expect to happen, that can be incredibly helpful. It's just a bit of a buffer, because when you are working in the outdoors, sometimes you're working in unexpected territory or spaces and you have no idea what potentially is going to happen when you're in that space. Or, you know, a lot of people who are new to the outdoors, I remember bringing an artist outdoor for the first time, and we spent all of our costume budget in 2 weeks figuring out the type of shoes for that choreographic practice that best worked on pavement. And it was like the hardest 2 weeks of our lives. And then we were like, what do we do? We've got no budget left for costumes now. So the contingency helped with that. So there are just really small things that happen in this territory. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll try and pick them up now and answer some of the questions. And we've got some questions that people had prepared earlier, which I'm going to pick up. It sounds like I'm hosting like the Big Breakfast on Channel 4 in 1993, where we've got prepared questions for panel guests. So there was one question which was about what is the maximum number of people that can tour, and what's the minimum, and how do we cost that? Does anyone want to pick up that? Because I think you've covered it a little bit. I mean, the number of people simply depends on the number of people you need. So if you need 3 people, you need to cost for 3 people, and you need 3 people. I wouldn't try and make any savings on people power. It's very, very, I wouldn't advise that. Charmaine?
I recently was having a conversation with a company that were thinking of making an outdoor show. I can't remember what the number was. It was something like 18 people that they wanted to have in it. And the thing that struck me really strongly in that conversation that I said to them is, I think it's really important, if you have a vision for something of that scale, to also build in a mini version, like, because the price of something that big will be really restrictive. So can you, in the creation process, make an A version and a B version, like a big version and a small version, where can you deliver the same concept with 4 people and have a more mobile version? And it's the same if you have like a big set idea. Can you have a mini idea that can do the same thing? That was, in case that's useful.
Just to add on to that as well, yes, it takes what it takes in terms of staff and resource to do what you want to do and achieve. But just the consideration, the more people you work with in terms of sustainably touring and being available to tour, the more artists and production involved, the more of a jigsaw it is to align that. So yeah, having backups or multiple casts, or building in additional blocks of rehearsal through the touring season might be advisable.
Yeah, great. That's really great advice. And there was another question that came in, which was for bookers, so for festivals and events and bookers, I'm assuming, around what the price was for not booking a show, gathering information on the extended value of a production, which I think is a really interesting question. But the things we've spoken about today, and the advice we're giving out for artists or producers or people creating work, is the same type of things that are being considered at the other end of the spectrum. So when I'm looking at a festival, I have a budget for the festival, and I cannot spend over the budget that's in the festival, and I have a contingency. But what you're trying to piece together is an experience for a range of people, with a range of shows, a range of performances, a range of experiences that will cost what they cost. So sometimes it's simply not about adjusting costs, and sometimes it's not about cost. It's actually about what you're trying to curate, what you're trying to make happen for that day, and what you might have supported, what you might have locally, what might already be in the context of that. So pricing, I've never had a moment. It happens more indoors, I feel, the pricing conversation, than outdoors. I've never had a moment of pricing being a problem with a booking. It might be that your show costs this much and I've got 3 shows that already cost that, so yours isn't in the program because the other 2 do X, Y, and Z for me. So how I try to do it is I try to make it very clear, what the shows bring to the table. Urban Astronaut, I've worked with Highly Sprung on for many, many years now, and it's a wonderful piece of equipment and an incredible show, but the message that is inside that show is incredibly powerful and important. And I remember seeing it in a space and it looked amazing, but there was a parent and a child sat in front of us, and at the end of the show, the child said to the parent, what do I do, mummy, to stop that lady living alone again? And in my head, I was like, where is my camera? Where's the phone? How do I capture this one moment? But that wraparound isn't going to be captured anywhere. So I think you have to believe you've priced your show how it needs to be priced, and it's fair. It's what you need to make it happen. And sometimes there's going to be moments where you're not outpriced. It's just not the right fit or the right time for that moment. So I would bear that in mind when we're thinking about that. I think we've got some questions coming in now, so I'm going to try and whip some of those out. So there's one here that says, what is the percentage of the fee that is charged if a show is pulled while on site for bad weather or other reasons? Does someone else want to cover that? Because I know what my answer is.
Yeah, 100% of it. I put into my planning, into my info pack, I put what my weather contingencies are. Like, if there's this level of wind, then I might need to cut some scenes, but I can still play the show. If there's this level of rain and the audience are settled, I can still continue to play the show, you know, and there is a difference of like, what is the situation, you know, like in some places I can keep playing in the rain, but in some situations the audience don't want to watch something in the rain, or I can play in the rain for longer on tarmac than I can on grass, because at some point the grass just turns into a mud pool. And so it's those things of going, you do everything you can to make it work, but if it's not going to work, then you're there, you've done the thing. And I've never had somebody ask me to cut it. I don't think you'd encounter that.
I think if you're on site, it's all of the costs. You have incurred every single one of those costs. Your team are there, your people are there, you have stayed. This is a cost. I do have a cancellation policy which leads up to the performance. So it has a series of dates and timelines when cancellation charges are in place, and that is mimicked in a contract for the performers. So the performers have the same agreement as we have with a festival. But I'm exactly in your boat, Charmaine. I've never been in a position where someone has tried not to pay for something. That just has not happened, which is great. You're very well cared for. The outdoor sector is very caring. Andrew?
Yeah, I'd like to echo that. Yeah, I think if you're on site, and also we had one situation where we were canceled the day of because of the field was too muddy. And I think those kind of situations, if it's that within 24 hours or even 48 hours, I think is the full cost. And then I think if it's a week, what we have in our policy, if it's more than a week, then it's 50%, and then I can't remember how many weeks, but a certain number of weeks, then they can cancel for full amount. But it's just completely unfair. And I think if they changed it, you know, because of course you've made the time, and if you're working with freelancers, you're paying them the full amount as well. But for us, it's always trying to, if there's a downpour at that moment, perhaps can we go perform in a slightly different place, or can we go a little bit later, or can we make 3 40-minute sets into two longer sets? And there's always something that we can generally do. And of course, it's also in the making of the performance to make sure that it's as weatherproof as possible, and there's some version that can go out so that the
I'm
clients.
So sorry to interrupt, Andrew. Could I just ask you to slow down, please?
Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
That's fine. What was I going to say? So there's some version of the performance that can be performed for the audience, and so the client and the audience feels like they're getting something at a special event, even if it's not the full show that you had intended.
And if you're, sorry to jump in, Phil, but if you're on your own as well, like that's one of the things that I was super proud of myself in the creating of the new show, because I was now touring with a bunch more technical equipment than I had before. I thought through like every single little, I was like, okay, I'm mid-show and it starts to rain. What happens? And I was like, okay, and so I've got the big secure bags to go over the speakers. But like I have in my head already action plan. If I was more professional, I probably would have like done a written little one, but it's all in my head. But it is, I think you think through all of those things in advance, so you're not in a panic.
Absolutely. Preparation and conversation and openness is absolutely key. There's a question from Chris here that talks about making light sculptures for festivals, all self-funded, can cost out time and expenses, but how do they cost the work itself in their fee? That's an interesting question. It's probably about understanding a bit more about the context of the sculptures, then go on to other places and other festivals, and do they do like a tour? Do they go to light nights, for example, over 10 light nights? But maybe Andrew or Charmaine might be able to help with pricing up art rather than rehearsals and costs. So if you've already made something, how do you then price the cost of that thing that's made out?
That's probably you, Andrew.
Well, I think it's a question of whether or not somebody has asked you to make it. And so is it a commission, or is it something that you've made on spec and trying to get paid for it? I think that's two very different things. If it's something that somebody asks us to make, we sort of calculate, this is how much we think we should get paid, and that might be different. You might be at different stages of the spectrum. Some people think they should get £100 a day for building. Some people get £200 a day, and so you just sort of have to calculate that, and of course the materials and those kind of things. But if you're making it on your own spec, I think that's harder, because honestly, it's going to take you a long time to make that back. And I think you just have to think about what's fair for yourself.
Yeah. And think about if it has a life beyond the space that it was originally created for. And if it does, how do you recuperate costs? Because you've made a piece of art and that costs, and that has cost. So understanding and recuperating is a good, I would suggest. Like, for example, Luke and the Museum of the Moon is an example of creating something that's a piece of art that then exists in other spaces, and that is costed appropriately for what that costs to deliver.
Yeah. One thing that I sometimes, when people ask us to make a commission, we give them two prices. We say, this is how much it costs if you own it completely. Once we finish, we deliver it and that's done. This is how much it costs if you use it for your event and then we own it afterwards, which of course is much less, because we know that we could take that and get bookings for it elsewhere.
Great. And then David has asked about site-specific work, but I have just actually written a blog for Without Walls that's going to be published, I think, soon, which is a top 10 tips of making work outdoors. And it covers some of the stuff to do with making site-specific pieces of work. So things like power and toilets and safety and staffing and all that kind of stuff is covered in there. So I would say look out for that. It might not be any help in the world, and if it's not, feel free to ask for my contact details, and I'm more than happy to chat to you about how we get a festival up and running, for example, which is very much a similar thing to creating something site specifically in times. And then there's a question here about how much time do you cost in for rehearsals. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that?
Again, show by show. When a show's up and running, we're generally not doing re-rehearsals before each time it goes out. It is worth commenting on the kind of general shape of the outdoor touring season, just if people aren't aware of it. But you're looking at summer months. It's generally weekend performance dates, so it's not like indoor sit-down touring where you're kind of in the same space or you're moving space to space within a week. Like, it's kind of weekend tour dates. But when a bit of work's ready and up, we're not re-rehearsing each week. However, artists are generally on site the evening before, and the general structure of the day is we request a technical rehearsal at all performances, just with some of the higher risk attached to circus, and similar to Charmaine, like testing surfaces and making sure that it's safe in each space. So we're often teching pre 11 o'clock in the morning when the festival opens, and might not be performing until 3, 4, 5, 6 later on in the day. So there's gaps of time to be rehearsing, and we're just used to working in that format of finding space to make that work. Pre-tour, at least a week, and that's just the cost that we have to. We've had Arts Council funding in the past. We've had Without Walls support for that in the past. Into next year, with Simple Cypher, for example, we won't try and get money from that again. That's just company reserves that we'll invest into having both casts re-rehearse that in the studio to then increase on tour booking potential, essentially.
Great.
Yeah, it depends.
Yeah. And then there's a question of that's coming around rehearsals and how much time do you cost for R&D? How much time do we cost for rehearsals? How much time do we cost for creation? And I think that's very bespoke. So as a producer, everybody I've worked with has taken different lengths and different times to make a piece of work. When we made Pulse with Joss, which was with that Walls Commission in 2019, we had spent 2 years before that where we'd gone to a series of festivals for 1 year and watched and observed and looked around, and we used some of our reserves to kind of fund that very early R&D and exploration of stuff. And then the next year we did, I think it was 3 weeks of R&D, but the 3 weeks of R&D were very much a very specific test where Joss worked outdoors for the whole 3 weeks with a dancer and a musician, and it was all outside because that was new territory. And that was about exploring how a practice sat outside, and the artist was very much the leader on how much time and space they needed in that development time. And then when we created it, we actually created it over 5 weeks, I think it was. So we made it in 5 weeks, which was another longer period of time. But after the R&D, we had 5 weeks creation because we needed 1 week with just the set, because it had a set. So we needed 1 week to play around with how the bodies interacted and moved and played with what the set was. So I think that's a very personal practice-based thing. And you have to be dead honest about that. So I would always overcompensate for R&D and overcompensate for creation times, just because you might find if it's new territory, it takes longer, or even if it's existing territory and you're exploring new practices, these are things you've not tested and tried before, and you might want to give yourself the space to fail or to test new ideas or to ask someone some questions. And you need that sense of space and freedom, because if you make something under pressure and then it goes out and you're at a festival and you've made it and it's very frantic, it's not a comfortable environment to kind of be in. Did you want to chip in there, Charmaine?
Yeah, and just thinking about that, if people are new to outdoor arts and that maybe trying to make work unfunded, there's a couple of, or with very limited funding, there's a couple of things that I kind of figured out over the last little bit. And one of them was because even though I was making strong enough with funding, it was during COVID times. And because of that, I would never have chosen to do it. I was mainly creating in January and February, which we were in lockdown. And so I took the budget that I had to work with my director, and we had planned only to do a couple of weeks, like for this one section of it, was like a couple of weeks in a space together was the plan, and then a following few days together later. And that was all we had, because it was, anyway, for reasons. But I took those couple of weeks that we should have been in a space together and spread that over Zoom sessions for a couple of months. And it was not only better for her because she has a child, so it meant that she could work around childcare super easily, which is something that I really value, as getting the chance to be an employer and put my money where my values are. That was a rare treat for me. But also it actually was a great process, because it gave me time to work with her, go away, and instead of being in a room together for 2 weeks and all having that pressure, there was so much space around it for it to breathe. And we could explore something physically, and then I could work on it for the rest of, for a whole nother week until our next short weekly session. And that was amazing. The other thing that I discovered is that the places where I had lined up to have residency time, obviously they were all locked down, but I ended up speaking to a local space that I wouldn't have had access to normally because it would have been busy with things, and asking, could I have a key? Could I just come? The building's closed anyway. Can I come in and work on my own in that space? And I would never have been bold enough to ask for something like that normally, but then they said yes. And so it made me realize that next time, when I'm re-rehearsing Strong Enough for next summer's tour, I've already lined up with a village hall that goes, because I'm moving up into a different area, and I've lined up with the village hall there that I can hire their space for £4 an hour. you know, like but finding local places that aren't general places. And one last thing is, if you're new, you may not know there are some spaces that are specifically out there for creating outdoor arts. So there's out there in Great Yarmouth and 101 in Newbury. So I know that Worthing Theatres and Museum are really generous with space for working things as well. So just in case you didn't know about those places.
Yep. Great. Thank you, everybody. I think we're going to wrap up there. If you've asked a question and we've not managed to answer, we're going to collect them all and we're going to get answers, and they'll be available on a PDF. It's been amazing to have such incredible speakers. So thank you, Andrew, Charmaine and Kevin. It is fantastic to hear your amazing experience. Thanks for sharing that with everybody. And I'm going to invite Irene back in to the room to finish up. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks again to all our wonderful speakers and our wonderful chair. And thanks as well to Bo, our captioner, and Jackson Kirsty, our BSL interpreters today. As a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be available on the Without Walls website in the coming days, together with some additional resources. Finally, I'd like to invite those of you who have specific questions about the current Without Walls open call to register for the upcoming online Q&A, which will take place on Tuesday, the 30th of November, 4 to 5 p.m. You will find the registration link on the Without Walls website, as well as on our social media channels. Thank you very much to everybody and have a lovely day.